Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about a little bit of the 12-team playoff and what it would take kind of to get into the 12-team playoff. Definitely some different monikers for some different conferences, for some different teams, for some different schedules. So it's going to be fascinating to watch that unfold. Definitely a very interesting thing for the future of scheduling in college football. But let's start to get into some sponsorships possibly coming to college football. This is something that I think we all probably should have saw coming, right? The House versus NCAA case has just finished, and with it, a lot of bills have become on the paybook for a lot of different athletic departments around the country. So you got to find a way to make that money. You got to find a way to get that, to bridge that gap. We've heard about private equity possibly getting involved. I've said time and again that's not necessarily my favorite way to go about things because I think that sets a very dangerous precedent. I think it opens some doors that we do not want opened in college football. But it sounds like sponsorships might be one of the answers to this, and it's definitely a very interesting concept. So when we look at this at face value, I think there is a little bit of energy of you hate it, right? It doesn't look good. You don't want, a big old all-state logo across the front of your jersey. Definitely not something that looks all that great, and definitely not something that I think a lot of us would love. But the reality is, when you look at the future of college sports and you look at what's going to happen with a lot of different teams in a lot of these different universities, you got to make the money and you got to find a way to bridge the gap, and especially for the smaller sports. Scott Strickland was the one that spoke about this, the Florida athletic director, and he said, there's an obvious revenue stream that we have not had in the past, which is putting things on the field and putting things on jerseys, and it would make a lot of money. It makes, tens of millions of dollars for the NBA teams when they instituted it not only a couple of years ago, and it's definitely something that is super important to the future of the sport because you got to make money. You have to make sure that not only college football, let's just put aside college football here for a second. There's going to be bills due for everyone, and there's going to be hard decisions that have to be made. And if you can make a little bit of money from sponsorships, or you can make a little bit of money here and there doing some different things, those questions become a little bit less dire. You are able to handle some of those smaller sports the way that we would all like them to be handled, where they get a little bit more respect, they get a little bit more money, they definitely keep moving. That's, I think, the biggest goal here is to make sure that we have all of these sports intact in the future, and this might be the best way to go about it. So it's obviously not necessarily something you'd love to see, but it might be something that we just have to do for college sports to stay the way that they are right now. Definitely something that's going to be really interesting. Another thing that Strickland brought up that I thought was fascinating was possibly bringing fantasy sports down to college football or college sports in general. It will be a fascinating thing if that were to happen. It's definitely something that builds a lot of interest in the NFL. I know people that don't really watch the NFL too much, but they love fantasy. So it's definitely something that would bring more eyes. It's definitely something that you can do now with a lot of the rules that are in place, where players are allowed to kind of use their name, use their image, use their likeness to do not necessarily anything they want, but they can do a lot of different things, and fantasy would be, I think, a great way to go about it. It would get more fan interest. It would get a little bit more money in the pockets of the people that, need it, these athletic departments right now. So definitely a double-edged sword, definitely something where you're a little bit worried, right? You don't want the traditional jerseys, the Penn States, the Alabamas, the Michigans to get ruined. You don't want the fields like Notre Dame, like the Big House, to be, slapped with a ton of different, sponsorships and a ton of different logos and make it, look a little bit less special. But the reality is this is kind of an interesting scenario where you don't have to do this by any means. It's definitely would be up to the school if they want to add these sponsorships to their logo. Now, obviously, you don't necessarily want to give up $10 million to someone who is doing it, but if you are Notre Dame, if you are Michigan, and you want to keep that pristine feel to your football stadium, you can do that pretty easily, and you can just say, no to this extra little bit of money, and as we've learned throughout this time, those schools don't necessarily need that extra money. Alabama's athletic director Greg Byrne talked about this, and he basically said he's going to be open-minded in the future, but doesn't necessarily see that being a thing they do, especially the jersey patches. You don't want to ruin those jerseys. They're as iconic as it gets in this sport. Penn State the same, Michigan the exact same. So I fully understand that this is going to be something that a lot of people are a little bit upset about, a lot of people don't like, because in other sports when it's happened, the NBA ones are a little bit rough to look at. I'll be totally honest with you. I don't love soccer jerseys having the big old one across the chest, but the reality is it does bring in a lot of money for them, and it helps some of the things in the back end look a little bit better. And right now, college sports needs as much help as it can get, making sure that everything is in order. Everything is perfectly the way it should be, and move forward with as many sports, all of the sports, if you can. And the only way to do that is with money. The only way to do that is to find these type of solutions, the sponsorships, possible private equity, even though I don't love it by any means. There's going to be answers that we probably don't love. But the reality is the money's got to come from somewhere to make sure that the softball team can play, and to make sure that the swimming team is still intact 5 years from now. And also to make sure that a lot of this stuff stays under the roof of the school, because there are talks about some of these going away from the school a little bit and maybe carrying the name but not being as attached to the school as it has been in the past. I think if you influx a little bit of more money into this, it makes it more worth the while of these teams to stay intact. So it's one of those things where you take one step backwards in terms of maybe the jerseys don't look as cool, maybe the stadiums don't have quite the same feel, but you might be able to take a couple of steps forward when it comes to college sports, where you can keep the softball team, you can keep the swimming team, you can keep the golf team, all of the teams that right now are probably biting their nails and worried about what the future looks like. This would subside some of those worries, and it's something that is hugely important to the future of college sports overall. So maybe this will hurt college football just a little bit. Maybe this is something that will definitely ruin a couple of really iconic jerseys, definitely throw a little bit of a wrench into some stadiums that we have gotten used to the way they look. But the reality is, when you look at the state of college sports right now, there's a lot of costs and there's not enough money to go around for a lot of these universities. So let's say your UCLA, we talked about them being in a little bit of a precarious situation with their athletic budget, and they can use this. And if they do use this, then they can possibly bridge some of those gaps that they have in their athletic budget and definitely subside some of the worries, at least, for at the very least, for some of these fans and some of these players. So it's one of those things where you don't necessarily love it, and I totally get that, and it's definitely something that I prefer if it didn't happen, if I'm being totally honest with you. But as long as the school has the choice, as long as it's something that is not, pushed on people, and especially as long as it keeps these college sports in the building and in the athletic department and running as real sports with scholarships, with all of these benefits these athletes get today, I'm all good. I have very little problem with that. I understand why people are going to have problems with this and why people will likely be a little bit more upset than they likely should be. But the reality is, we're in a new era of college football. We're in a new era of college sports. And with that comes a little bit more money and a little bit more of finding that money in places where we might not love it. And frankly, if this is the alternative to private equity, sign me up 10 times out of 10, because I do not necessarily want an outside group being involved in any decision-making that goes on in an athletic department. I'll be totally honest with you. I don't want anyone that their sole goal is to make a lot of money inside college athletics. Now, sponsorships would, bring that into the fray, but it wouldn't bring the actual company in those decision-makings for the future of college football. It would just put a little bit more money in those athletic departments' pockets, while maybe, altering the field just a little bit or altering the jersey just a little bit. So it's going to be one of those things where I can only imagine that people are going to be upset. I can only imagine that people are going to, throw their hands up and say this is the death of college football and everything is changing and we're done, we're dead in the water. But the reality is, this is a very benign change for what the future of college football could have been, where maybe you don't do this and then you run into money problems and some sports start to get cut off and there's some very, very sketchy dealings in the future of college sports in general. So this is one of those things. It's a small loss for college football maybe, but it's a huge win for college sports in sense of just having the money to deal with all of this stuff that's coming down the pipe. So it's going to be one of those fascinating things to watch. Definitely will be something that I'm sure people on Twitter are blowing up about in the next couple of days, but I promise it's not that big a deal. And I promise if you really want your team not to do it, email your athletic director and try to convince him not to do it. So it'll be fascinating to watch that unfold. Definitely some interesting matchups that could happen between sponsorships and schools. Definitely will be a fun thing to watch, but we'll definitely break that down as it comes. But we're going to take our third break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some of the scheduling updates. Some big-time changes have happened to some big-time rivalries in this game, so I definitely want to break that down, as well as some other just smaller games that definitely will have a lot to do with this upcoming college football season. So stick around, and we will break that down right after this.